Well, hi, Laird. It's great to have you on Skype. You're a very famous author. You've written 9 books. You're on your 10th. You're on your 11th. And, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Okay, well, Maria, thank you very much for talking with me today. It's great to see your face again, hear your voice. I'm uh, an independent researcher. I'm the author of a series of books, controversial books on ancient cosmology and language, ancient symbology and language. Um, my entry point to studies is through an African tribe called the Dogon, but there are comparisons made. The African tribe is their culture is a kind of umbrella over 3 ancient traditions. They have rituals like ancient Egypt. They have I'm sorry, civic practices like ancient Egypt, rituals like Judaism, and a symbolic cosmology like ancient Buddhism. So they make an excellent entry point to try to understand what were ancient cultures talking about. My approach is basically to examine an element one culture talks about and then test the understanding of that element against how other ancient cultures understood the same thing and sort of triangulate in on a meaning. And I've been following that progression of meaning geographically from Africa to Egypt to India and Tibet to ancient Turkey to China to Orkney, north of Scotland, and most recently to the Maori in New Zealand. A book I'm working on the focus is on tracing the origins of the Orkney tradition that come out of Anatolia, out of the Göbekli.
That's incredible. I mean, that is quite groundbreaking.
Well, I'm very lucky to have the value of the comparisons is once you can establish that they're all talking about the same thing, then each one serves as a cross-check on the other. The Dogon words are essentially ancient Egyptian words, so I can demonstrate that meanings haven't changed because the ancient Egyptian dictionary upholds what the Dogon says a word means. Or the Buddhist symbolic tradition, authorities on the Buddhist tradition in the modern day are in agreement with modern authorities on the Dogon tradition about meanings of symbols and concepts. So these cross-checks give us some credibility that we're not imposing interpretations on things, that this was the ancient view of how things were understood.
Well, that's incredible by itself, that all of these different cultures across the world have the similar kind of meanings and language, especially with ancient Egypt and, a small West African tribe, in effect.
Yes, that's true. As we trace these things, there are certain signatures we can follow to sort of keep ourselves on track. For example, there are naming conventions for the ancient tribes that had who were influenced by this symbolic tradition. The classic example is combines an Egyptian word to celebrate, sakai, with a syllable that represents a concept of cosmology. So it's almost as if tribal groups were naming themselves by declaring a major subject of study. There's a group called the Naki or Naxi in Tibet and China. Their name means celebrates the mother goddess or celebrates the non-material feminine, which is what the syllable Na refers to. There are the Amazighi tribes in Northwest Africa or North Africa, celebrates Amma. Even on Orkney, you have the Skara Brae village overlooking the Bay of Scale, which phonetically to me says celebrates El. El was a god of space who comes out of the Canaanite tradition, a counterpart to God of the Hebrew god Yah, who was the god of light. So then things like that, following naming conventions, following symbolic developments, following agricultural developments and cultural developments, you can sort of trace these cultures through a path.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And for listeners that aren't sure, about the Dogon tribe, I mean, they came up with some quite incredible insights into Sirius without the use of telescopes, which is widely documented, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, and obviously there have been people who debunk that. The Dogon in 1975, the Dogon came to public attention because they knew some things about astronomy they shouldn't reasonably know without having access to telescopes. They knew that there were two stars, not one in the Sirius system, actually more than two. But they knew the correct orbital period for the binary stars there. They knew specific details about the nature of the stars. Um, but that, for me, that's just the tip of an iceberg of a much greater body of knowledge that the Dogon are in possession of. That, as a society, they prioritize preserving in original form.
Okay, then. So they knew aspects about a very distant star system, Sirius. They even knew its orbital path of about 50 years. How do you think they knew that?
Well, my ethic is okay. The biggest threat to my field of study is wishfulness, the human natural tendency towards wishfulness in human perception. We know children look up at the sky and envision animals instead of clouds. It's very easy to chase off against what looks like a resemblance to a modern eye, but didn't mean anything to an ancient eye. So my ethic is that interpretations begin with the cultures we're studying. And my job is to test the reasonableness of what the ancient culture says. I can give you an excellent example of Dogon knowledge that they shouldn't have, advanced astronomical knowledge that they shouldn't have, that applies fairly universally as an archetype across cultures, if you're willing to hear it.
Yeah, that would be great.
This is a little bit complicated. We know from books like Hamlet's Mill that many cultures imagined a wheel or a chariot associated with the constellation of Orion, and there's no outward reason for that to be. I mean, there's no outward cause why very distant cultures would both imagine that same odd thing. You look up at Orion, and there's nothing to suggest a wheel.
No.
Well, in Dogon mythology, there is a character named Ogo who plays the role of light in the Dogon creation myths. And one of the things that Ogo does, Ogo is a counterpart to an Egyptian god of light called Aku. Now, one of the things that Ogo does is he measures out the universe in 8 billion steps. Now, I know that the word step, quote unquote step, is one of the definitions of a cubit. You can measure a cubit as the length of the forearm of a person or as a step of a person. So also much larger than 8 billion cubits. However, one of the figures that's commonly given for the size of the visible universe is 8 billion light years.
Really? That's incredible.
Now, since Ogo plays the role of light, the suggestion is that someone was setting up an equivalence, a symbolic equivalence between cubits and light years. So I go to the Hieroglyphic Dictionary and I discover that an ancient word for cubit was Aku Me, or literally, you can interpret that two ways. It's either Ogo's measure or it's light measure. So now we have tentative confirmation that someone here is talking about light measures. So then I ask myself, how is it that we know how big a cubit is? The way we know that the size of a cubit is that researchers inferred the length of it from the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid measures 440 royal cubits per side of its square base, and it stands 280 cubits high. My friend Robert Bobal suggests that the three large pyramids at Giza were meant to represent the three belt stars of Orion, that their configuration as they're set on the ground is a match for the configuration of the three stars of the belt stars of Orion. But Boval doesn't provide us with a rationale for why that might be. He notes the resemblance, but he doesn't have a reason why they would have wanted to do that. As it turns out, the Dogon also placed large stones on a plateau to represent stars, including the belt stars. And the Dogon say that their reason for doing that is to point us to a structure they call the Chariot of Orion. The French anthropologists who studied them imagined when they said Chariot of Orion that what they were referring to was the entire constellation of Orion.
Right.
But I go back to my cubits and my pyramids, wondering where to go from there. And out of desperation, I go to Google and I type in Orion 440 280 and press enter, and I turn up references to an astronomical structure called Barnard's Loop. This is a spiraling birthplace of stars that centers on the belt stars of Orion. The light is so very faint that you can't see it with the naked eye. You can only see it if you image it with time-lapse photography. But when you image it, the spiral is set such that it looks like the wheel of a chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in.
That's incredible. That is incredible.
Well, now, beyond that, Barnard's Loop measures 440 light years by 280 light years.
Wow. To pyramid cubit dimensions.
Yes, precisely. So now the reason the Dogon give us for wanting to point us to that structure is they say that it represents a macrocosmic version, or how can I say, a counterpart to a tiny spiral of matter that exists at every point in space-time that the Dogon describe. And the Dogon description of their tiny spiral of matter is a match for the scientific description of Barnard's Loop. It's classed as a stellar bubble, and it has certain attributes about how it was formed and what's expected to happen with it that are all in agreement with the Dogon descriptions of their tiny spiral of matter. So here what we have is an objective illustration of the Hermetic principle of as above, so below. The Dogon are saying, don't worry about those things you can't see. These processes are parallel. So if you want to understand the tiny spiral of matter, look to the spiral you can see, study that, and you can infer from that what's going on with the tiny spiral of matter.
Wow.
So now, because of this, I understand that any culture that refers to a wheel or to a chariot associated with Orion has to have been influenced by the same symbolic tradition. That's the only way you get to that symbolism. You don't just make that up.
No.
So recently in my studies, I've been studying connections for the symbolic tradition across the Mediterranean, and seem to move into Orkney at around 3600 BC or so, just before that. And one of the groups in the Mediterranean that I was concerned about are called the Eteo-Cretans. The original, these are called the true Cretans. And it's a group that includes the Garamantians, who also had influence in the regions just west of Egypt, in what is now Libya. There was a region called the Fezzan that the Garamantians were in. Well, one of the things the Garamantians did was they made cliff paintings that look an awful lot like Dogon cliff paintings, but they kept repeatedly painting these odd images of a hunter on a chariot, or a chariot driver on a chariot, but very odd images. I mean, these could be pictures of Evel Knievel jumping things on a motorcycle. The chariot is very oddly positioned. The perspective is a very odd perspective. And so the academic researchers who study this have no theory as to why would these be represented that way. And they're often represented in regions where no chariot could ever reasonably have gone. So it's not as if someone was painting what they were seeing. There was another reason for painting it. So I thought, a chariot, they're painting chariots, eh? That suggests to me that they're connected to the symbolic tradition that I'm studying. The problem is, how do I explain the fact that in their paintings they don't show a single wheel? They show two wheels.
Okay.
So symbolically, that says to me there must be a second circular shape associated with Barnard's loop that I don't know about, that the Dogon don't recall about. So I did some research and discovered, sure enough, there's a second loop there. Taken together, they're called the Eridanus Barnard, or the Barnard Eridanus superbubble. And when you image both loops together, it looks just like the configuration of wheels that the Garamantians were painting on their cliffs.
That's incredible. You blow my mind.
So now I have an interpretation for why they were painting that, and I also have more confidence that these early cultures in Crete were influenced by the very same tradition that I have been pursuing in these other localities.
Well, so that really does bring into sharp focus, really, the wheel tradition and Orion and the kind of whole meaning behind it as well. I find that quite fascinating, the kind of symbolism of it all, you know, and the spiral and working with that type of energy. So, well, I mean, that's absolutely incredible.
Well, this all has a deeper level of meaning because it relates to fundamental dynamics of energy that the processes of creation seem to rest on. Another of those dynamics is illustrated by the Sirius Stars themselves. The Sirius Stars, the way they move in relation to each other is a dynamic of energy called angular impulse. It's what causes energy to spin. And the Sirius Stars, or binary stars, there's a bright sun-like star called Sirius that we would call Sirius A, and a small dwarf star, very dense, heavy dwarf star that's dark, it doesn't emit light, called Sirius B. And the way they move in relation to each other illustrates this dynamic of energy that's at the very root, very foundation of concepts of creation. And when they spin, they produce vectors of energy that culminate in a spiral, just like what we see with Barnard's loop. So the suggestion is that we're seeing the same dynamic of energy playing out with those stars and with Barnard's loop spiral as the Dogon are describing at the foundation of matter.
That's that's quite incredible. I mean, it all is quite, you know, fascinating. And your work is all taken you sort of around the world in a way, hasn't it? To places like China, symbolism, and Egypt, and Orkney as well, as you know, obviously the Dogon of Western Africa. Where's the connection then with Orkney?
Our first evidence of this tradition begins at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey at around 10,000 after 10,000 BC. Now, what the Dogon and Buddhists are saying is that in ancient times, a civilizing plan was deliberately instructed to humanity, a civilizing plan that was closely linked to a symbolic cosmology or creation tradition. And at Göbekli Tepe in that region, we see the first evidence of all of the civilizing skills. It's the first place where we see deliberate agriculture. We see domestication of animals. We see the emergence of metallurgy. We see the first megalithic stonework. We see the rudiments of language, of written language. We see the rudiments of pottery and of weaving. All of these civilizing skills begin in that region, and they can trace those outward from sort of in all directions from that region, with DNA studies, with studies of language, with studies of how civilizing skills spread. One of the translations for the name Göbekli Tepe is Central Hill. It's the same meaning that applies to the Greek term opolis. The ancient Greeks used to place their temples on centrally located hills, and attached a suffix opulis to the end of it. Well, Göbekli Tepe is situated in a very central geographic region, and from there it looks as if this tradition spread in all directions. And that's why the Chinese have it in Asia, and the Egyptians have it, in Africa, and the Dogon have it in West and North Africa. Why it passed through the Mediterranean, why it ended up going through Gibraltar and up the coast of Europe as far as Orkney. And there are ways of positively tracing. Archaeologists try to trace some of the agricultural elements and some of the pottery elements, but it's equivocal for them because from their point of view, various animals and various plants that originated in Anatolia in the Göbekli Tepe region might have moved sort of piecemeal across Europe, or they might have moved together as a group. There's one group of researchers who believe that there was deliberate colonization of the major islands in the Mediterranean for agriculture, and that a specific cluster of elements very well suited to the establishment of agriculture were deliberately brought to Crete, to Cyprus, to other major islands in the Mediterranean. This is the same cluster of elements that we see appear on Orkney at around 3600 BC, the same cluster of elements that appear at Stonehenge a few hundred years after that. It looks as if someone was deliberately colonizing these localities for agriculture. But when we trace those agricultural elements side by side with the cosmological elements, the symbolic elements, we know for certain that the symbolic elements moved as a cluster. They belong together. This is an instructed tradition. You don't get a single archetype element moving by itself. Jung saw the whole entire clusters moving. I mean, a culture that had one of the elements has a handful of the elements at least. Mm-hmm. So these moved as clusters. So if we can show that the agricultural elements moved side by side with the symbolic elements, now we have a basis to make the argument that this was all deliberate, that it all moved together. The same people who brought the symbols brought the agriculture. And so that's sort of the thrust of the manuscript I'm just finishing up right now. It traces a path of transmission from southern Turkey to Orkney in a way that credibly explains all of the different elements we see on Orkney from the beginning, the ones that are unique to Orkney in the United Kingdom. We can also see that there are direct connections between Orkney and Stonehenge. At Durrington Walls, which is situated not very far from Stonehenge, there is a Neolithic house that is in every way a duplicate of one of the Skara Brae houses from around 2600 BC. It's the same dimensions, same physical layout of the rooms, same placement of stone pieces of furniture. It's a duplicate, and it served as a pattern for stone houses in the UK following around 2600 BC. So we also see that the first layout of Stonehenge, the first placement of stones at Stonehenge, was almost a duplication of the Ring of Broadcar on Orkney. Same dimensions, same types of placements, same concept. So it looks as if someone from Orkney who was very knowledgeable about stonework was involved in the establishment of the stone placement at Stonehenge.
Well, that's right. I mean, Mike Parker Pearson of UCL, he pointed out, the Durrington houses, they are, because he did the archaeology of both Skara Brae area and the elsewhere as well. So that is really fascinating. And also the cattle was brought down because when they started to analyze the types of foods that they were eating, they shipped lots of cattle down from the north of England to the south. There was those huge links, and on a bit of a different level, there's a huge ley line that goes right the way through Stonehenge, links to just outside of Avebury, that goes right up to the to quite close to the Ring of Bodgar. So I think
Right.
that
It ends right there at the Standing Stones of Stennis. There's a definitely ley line connection between the Standing Stones of Stennis and the Ring of Brodgar.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's lots of different.
That extends down into Rennes in France.
Right. Yeah. And with the Darrington walls, you there, Laird? Broke up a little bit. Yep, you're back. That's brilliant.
Okay.
With there was a brilliant Lithuanian archaeologist called Maria Gimbutas, and she often pointed out that the cairns in places like Scotland and Ireland, and some in the British Isles, like the West Kennet Long Round, were all laid out to represent us in like bodily form. And she's written, great books on that. And there's a similarity, isn't there, between that idea and the houses on Orkney?
Yes, the Orkney houses are a conceptual match for houses the Dogon still build when they build from stone. The Dogon are situated in the desert in Mali, southern Mali, and they normally build from mud. But when they build from stone, they build to a specific plan that expressly represents the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. And ties right into the same system of cosmology I'm talking about. So that's one of the primary links for me between Orkney and the Dogon is researchers on Orkney had no theory for why the houses were built the way they were. They could find no counterparts to the houses anywhere in Scandinavia or locally in Europe. But the connection to the Dogon is pretty explicit. And the same house plan appears in numerous other locations, and not just the house plan, the situation of that house plan in view of mountains that look like the island of Hoy looks from Standing Stones of Stennis. That configuration of mountains became important in Hinduism. Hinduism says that sacred sites were deliberately established in view of mountains that look like elephants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case because even very early Mesolithic sites studied by Maria Gimbutas focused on a mountain in Eastern Europe. So that's very important. And the author Michael Dames, he points out that Silbury Hill, if you take into consideration the moat that surrounds it, the ditch that would have been filled with water all year round, that's almost identical in shape to the Sleeping Lady that was found in the Hypogeum in Malta. So we've again got this like Sleeping Lady figure that seems to be prominent in numerous different cultures.
Yes, the city of Valletta in Malta was configured to represent the sleeping lady or sleeping goddess. We have any number of connections to this. Researchers in Crete don't realize that they have house plans there that predate Orkney.
I think you've just cut out.
Path of transmission that went. That in Crete, they have the researchers in Crete don't understand that they have examples of that same house plan from Neolithic Crete. But because of those predate the Orkney houses just a very short amount of time. So that's part of how we can trace the tradition from southern Turkey through the islands across Crete, such that Neolithic people on Crete become the farmers on Orkney, are educated on Orkney in a tradition that I see occurring there, and then return back to where they came from on Crete, and now become the pre-Minoans and the pre-Greeks. Language even does that for us. There's an ancient language on Orkney called Faroese language. Now, in Crete, they don't have an etymology to explain the name of the Eteo-Christians, the Eteo-Cretans, the people who are called the true Cretans. But the Faroese word et, A-E-T-T, means ancestor. So if we consider that term, in terms of the Faroese language, the term becomes sensible. These are the ancestral Cretans. With the Garmentians, it's the same case. This is a Cretan language term that they don't understand. But the word Gara in the Faroese language means to act or to accomplish. And the word Menetean means humans or people. So Garamantian refers to the accomplished people, the people who were experts. And that's the concept that applies to a Dogon priest, a Hogan, or to a Maori priest who follows the same model as a Dogon Hogan, who are treated as experts in a subject. There are many, many different linguistic connections from Orkney to Crete, where words that are not well understood in the Aegean language, in terms of Aegean languages, are become immediately sensible if we look at Faroese instead. Same with Greek terms. The word Hades in Greek corresponds to a Faroese word Haed, H-A-E-D-D, that refers to the lowest part of something. Even the Greek term Elysian, the Elysian Island, or the Elysian Fields. Yeah. This is the Greek concept of the field of reeds, the Egyptian field of reeds. Pindar describes the Elysian Fields as being, in terms that relate directly to Orkney, he describes it as a white island situated just off the west coast of Europe, of the continent of Europe, surrounded by rivers of water, a place of high winds, even refers to it as Okeanos. So we're even down to the phonetics of the name of Orkney. Lots of reason to think that the Greeks were talking about, okay, in the Faroese language, the phonetic EY means island. So there are connections. Hoi used to be called Ha'ai, which refers to high island. Many other connections that way that can be made with the Faroese words, tie things together and affirm a connection between the two.
Yeah, there definitely does seem with your research to be that connection phonetically and other, even like we're saying with the design of the houses and the way that people lived. What I find fascinating as well with some of the archaeology done on Orkney is that the temples that were on, the Ness in between Brodgar and the stones of Stirness, yes, they could have been very colourfully painted with golds and red of, ochre, and maybe even the standing stones there. And today we see everything through our eyes, 4,500 years Orthodox dating later, to be quite, grey looking. Do you think they could have been brightly painted? What's your view on the use of paint in Orkney?
Well, it makes more sense that they were brightly painted if we see a connection to the Minoans in Crete, because the Minoans did the same thing. It makes more sense that they were brightly painted if we see a connection to ancient Egypt. In Egypt, at Abydos, in the first dynasty, their burial chambers, which are understood to be have a relationship to houses, take the same form as the Dogon house. And they're set in a cemetery that overlooks mountains that look like the mountains from Hoi. So there's every reason to think that we have a connection to ancient Egypt as well, and the Egyptians also painted things colorfully. So it makes perfect sense to me that if they have evidence that the Ness of Brodgar site, that they were painted, that makes perfect sense to me.
They've even found the paint pots there, the tiny little palettes that were probably used as well to put the colour in. And when I've been to Orkney on the several times that I have and taken tours there, etc., I have found lumps of hematite, and they're gold. So I found a lot of gold ochre in the area anyway, just naturally deposits of it. So I think they would have definitely neutralized that since it is such a local stone. So we can see all these cultures being linked then from go from Turkey right the way across to Orkney. And also in your work, you talk about links with China as well, don't you? And even the Polynesian culture.
Right. Okay, if we imagine the tradition begins at Göbekli Tepe, just following the end of the Ice Age, we might even see it as an effort at a recovery following the Ice Age, a deliberate effort at recovery for humanity following the Ice Age.
Sure.
And then we see influences that go out in different directions. In Egypt, I see signs that there were influences contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, an attempt to establish agriculture in Egypt at 10,000 BC. That makes sense if we subscribe to the view that the Sphinx points to Leo at 10,000 BC and that the belt stars point to Orion at 10,000 BC. Now, if we entertain that outlook, there are really only two possibilities. Either those alignments were set at 10,000 BC when they could actually see the structures, or else we have to entertain the idea that somebody in some later era had the means to retrospectively calculate what the alignment should have been. Seems a lot more reasonable to me to think that someone made the placements at least, did the alignments at least at 10,000 BC. The carving of the Sphinx is completely in keeping with traditions of the Shakti cult, which emerged to the north and west of India in ancient times in the direction of Göbekli Tepe. They were one of their traditional practices was to do animal carvings out of natural outcroppings of rock, which is what the Sphinx is. So then we have immediate connection influences on Egypt at around 10,000 BC. We see evidence of influences on China by around 3,000 BC, Tibet and China. We see influences through Mongolia and Siberia that tie to North America. If we consider the concept of a stupa, an aligned shrine, as being a grand symbol of the symbolic tradition, in Siberia and Mongolia we have a form of portable shrine called a yurt, and there are 4 different styles of yurt. The most sophisticated style is a match for a house, both in structure and symbolism.
Wow.
The least sophisticated is a structure built from poles and animal skins, called a teepee, that is a match structurally and symbolically for a Native American teepee. So through the structure of that shrine, we can make a connection into North America that North American tribes were also aware of the same symbolic tradition. So then we have one path of transmission from Turkey that follows down to the east and south into India, as far as Australia, through the auspices of the Shakti cult, which is a matriarchal tradition. We have another path of transmission that goes down through Palestine, as far as Egypt again. We have another path of transmission that seems to travel across the Mediterranean island by island, out Gibraltar, up the coast of Europe, and as far as Orkney, and then southward again into the United Kingdom. And the Dogons say that the tradition was that 8 representatives, 8 initiates from each tribal group were taken to a remote locality and instructed in cosmology and in agriculture, and then returned to their home locality to teach everybody else. Well, that's another of the archetype themes that Jung talks about. We see it with ancient cultures all over the world. They all talk in one form or another about quasi-mythical ancestors who were the bringers of civilizing skills. And we see it among cultures that should have had no direct connections with each other, very far distant from each other. the sites on Orkney are abandoned around 2600 BC, but at 3000 BC, maybe 200 years into the instructional era, we see the appearance of 4 agriculturally based kingships. One in Egypt called Taru, one in China called Iru, one in Ireland called Aru, and one in South America called Peru. These words in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language are carry meanings that refer to the 4 cardinal points. They can also be interpreted to refer to 4 progressive stages of agriculture, from an uncultivated field to a planted field to a field with crops growing in it to granaries with harvested crops. So we have that sort of connection also going on. And in each of those cases, those agriculturally based kingships spring up against a backdrop of no development that we can find archaeologically, that suddenly we have a fully blown, successful agriculturally based kingship where we had nothing archaeologically before that, or nothing self-sustaining. So lots of reasons to connect these things. I see another path of connection that comes out of India and into Elephantine Island around 4000 BC at the south in the Egypt. The first influences on Elephantine.
You broke up then. 4000 BC was that?
Yes. Now at Elephantine, you have an intermix of many different traditions, including the first Hebrew temple. But Elephantine Island is situated in view of another one of these elephant mountains. It looks almost precisely the same shape that is taken by a sleeping elephant. So we have comparable symbolism as well as other things going on at Elephantine. So the reason why the Egyptian symbolism is so complicated and difficult to understand is because we're seeing an intermix of 3 different paths of influence at least. We have 10,000 BC influences directly from Turkey. We have indirect influences through India at Elephantine at 4000 BC. And we have what look like direct influences from Orkney just at the beginning of dynastic Egypt.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a whole layers that you've been uncovering linguistically and otherwise. And you was mentioned earlier that you've got a couple of new books in the pipeline, because you're such a prolific author. You really are. I mean, I said when we first met up, oh, you've got 9. No, it's gone to 11. Wow.
Well, you can imagine that in doing research, if you imagine conceptual piles, making piles of things, that the pile of references that I can definitively pin down is a pretty short pile. The pile of references that I potentially can pin down is a larger pile. And then the stack of references that I have no clue how they tie together is a very, 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 very large stack. Well, every so often, just the right piece of evidence falls into place, and now a whole book's worth of information comes out of that tall stack, and I can sit down and write a book.
Oh, it's so. What are your forthcoming books covering then, Laird?
I have a book from Inner Traditions that will be out in July called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients.
Primal Wisdom of the Ancients. That's a lovely title.
The focus of the book is on deliberate choices that we can point to that someone made that reflect the fact that this was a deliberately instructed tradition. These are conscious techniques that were being used with symbolism, with mythology, and so forth, with general instruction, with the formulation of language, with the formulation of units of measure, all sorts of other aspects of this tradition. We can see reflections of the hand of a pedagogue at work here, a teacher, someone who is very capable of sorting out how best to instruct a thing in an intuitive way and have it be remembered for thousands of years. One of the examples I give to people who are skeptical of that is I ask them to, explain to me what they feel the symbolism of an owl is. And most often they'll say, well, an owl represents knowledge. And I say to them, have you ever studied cosmology? And they said, no. I said, that's 5,000-year-old symbolism that you're aware of, having never studied it. This is how tenacious the symbolism is, how effective whoever it was who put the system together was at linking ideas to images.
Well, that's it. I mean, we all do know kind of deep down in us, whether it's on a kind of, it's sometimes even on an intuitive level, what certain symbols mean. So this great sort of teacher was, back in the prehistoric times, conveying all of this, like cosmology and agriculture as well, I presume, and monumental building in a kind of package.
Yes, in an instructional package, and what we see reflected in various ancient traditions are what those traditions recall of that. There was a famous there's a comedy show in the United States called Saturday Night Live, and years ago they did a bit called the 5-Minute University. The concept of the 5-Minute University is you pay the student pays the university $25 to teach them what they will remember 10 years after graduating college of a subject. So the course on economics is supply and demand. That's the entire course, supply. So we have reflected in these ancient cultures sort of the 5-Minute University result of an ancient tradition. You put all the pieces together, and now suddenly you have an idea of what's very interesting is that the concept of Osiris in Egypt, I now have a context to put that into. For many years I didn't. Only recently have I put it together. There is a single concept of a goddess that tracks through this path of transmission for me from Anatolia to Orkney back to Egypt and other places. And it centers on a goddess whose name is Asherah. Now in Egypt, Asher is the name of a deity who's associated with Osiris. In the early matriarchal version of this tradition, it was the mother goddess whose body was dismembered and parts scattered to all parts of the world and would later reconstituted.
Really?
That's a metaphor for what I'm doing. That's the same myth that applies to Osiris in Egypt.
Exactly.
But it occurred to me that's precisely a metaphor for precisely what I've been doing. I've been taking a system of instruction that was effectively decimated with its parts scattered everywhere and finding ways to pull it back together as a whole. And Asherah, her influence arguably extends to Orkney, arguably it passes on from there into Crete and into ancient Greece. We see echoes of it in ancient Egypt with Asher. We certainly see it in Osiris. We see it in Ishtar in the Sumerian culture. It's all the same concept, with the name just morphed just enough so that we don't recognize it.
Yeah, to slight changes as it's kind of moving and rolling through time. Laird, if there was anything that you could say, or a few things that you could say, what can we really learn as a modern generation of people? What could we, apply from the ancient world to today's culture?
The Dogons say that there were two primary objectives of this instruction on the part of the instructors. The first was to help us to understand our true relationship as humanity to the larger processes of creation. The idea was that if we understood what our true place was, modern academics, what John Anthony West used to refer to as the School of Progress. In the view of the School of Progress, humanity is the final culmination of all of this, that we're the be-all and end-all of the processes of progress. In the ancient view, we're not. In the ancient view, we're just another step along a chain that has parallelism to it and structure to it. And that by helping us understand what our true relationship is to that structure, they have confidence that we will make better choices about how we live and how we choose to spend our time and what our focus is, as opposed to what we do right now. So that's the first goal, is to put us in the right orientation about how things really are. The second goal is to foster in us a sense of discriminating knowledge. Now, the easiest way to explain that is with the concept of an inference. We all should be aware of the fact that facts are important. We can learn facts from books about some subject matter, but the true power of knowledge comes when we are able to draw an inference from those facts. I'll give you an example. My background is in computer programming.
Okay.
I learned early in my process that if we have a computer file that has 1 million entries in the file, and those entries are not in any particular sequence, my only choice if I want to find a particular one of those entries is to start looking through the entries one at a time until I come across the one I want. Potentially I may have to look 1 million times to find it. However, if I'm aware that the entries have been sequenced in a particular order, there's a technique I can use, dividing the set in half, and then comparing whether the item I find is greater or less than the value I'm looking for. I can find the value I'm looking for in 30-some searches. So that inference is hugely important to a programmer, because it means instead of making 1 million searches, you can make 30 searches and find the thing you're looking for. That's the kind of thing that's the hope was to foster in humanity an ability to do that. A lot of the work I'm doing, the example I gave you of Barnard's loop,
That's fascinating.
Came as a result of facts, but I needed to make certain inferences along the way to put those facts together. They weren't automatically placed side by side with each other. I had to make some leaps of observation to get to it. That's the sort of thing they're trying to teach us to do.
That's yes. So really, when we kind of look back across, all of that time, going back to the kind of birth in Turkey, and we're going back thousands and thousands of years with all of these different cultural identities coming into play. Do you feel that back in the ancient world there was a real connection between different cultures because of the similar applied ideals to their lifestyles? Or do you think it was still more separated like it is today?
You can compare it to a class reunion. For a class you've graduated. When you go to a class reunion, you might run into a person who you never really knew when you were in having your schooling. But when you walk up to them and you speak to them and you get to know them a little bit, you realize they have everything in common with you. They have all the same references you do to music, to cultural events. They probably have references to the same people who taught you. They were taught many of the same techniques in many of the same ways. That's the relationship I see between these ancient cultures. They are all products of the same deliberate instruction by the same careful teacher. And so they have everything in the world in common with each other. The further we move away from that era, the more diffuse, the more scattered those commonalities become, the harder it becomes to tie back together again. But in BC, they had everything in the world in common with each other.
Yeah, that's what I've always felt about, the ancient prehistoric times. There seem to be people coming together to build monuments. You need a lot of, organization and people working together. And they seem to be very galvanized to make these structures, whether it's Silbury Hill in my area or, another monument somewhere else. And they seem to have a fixed purpose. And obviously these monuments have stood the test of time because we still look at them today. And they still draw us, don't they? I mean, so many people, I've done a tour with you, Laird, and the people feel drawn today, though, don't they, back to these ancient times where, you know, you're saying that these people were taught by this one person, and this culture kind of grew out of it, and they still speak to us across time when we go to these places. That's what I love about the
Absolutely.
monumental past. They speak to us, and you have an amazing story about, you know, Orion and the cosmology, and your studies, like I say, they're groundbreaking. That's what I love about you, Laird. You're just so groundbreaking. And you join the dots from, you know, Robert Brevall rather, saying it was, you know, Orion, to this is because it's this part of Orion. And you seem to have taken the research to a very deep level, and it's to be congratulated.
Well, thank you. I know your focus is on energy, and one of the things I wanted to mention to you today is that it occurred to me the other day to explore what the Faroese word for energy was.
Okay.
It was Orkan, O-R-K-N. So in terms of Faroese roots, Orkan I means energy island. Literally.
It's
the
getting
same
better by the minute, Laird. Energy Island. I really like that, actually. I really do.
I think I've mentioned to you that just before the era of Skara, Brae, the loch of Stennis became suddenly salinated, heavily salinated, whereas the loch of Hare has been fresh water. Now, what sits between those two bodies of water at Stennis is a clay isthmus of land. Wet clay is one of the best conductors of electrical energy, and dry clay is one of the best insulators. That's why they use clay squares as the insulators on the outside of the space shuttle, because it's an excellent insulator for heat and for electricity. So when they placed iron-rich sandstone set in clay between a body of salinated water and a body of fresh water, they created a battery, whether they intended to or not. Now, at the point where Orkney was suddenly abandoned, just before it was suddenly abandoned, the loch of Stennis suddenly became much less salinated, which means they had much less of a differential in potential energy between one and the other.
So
I know that.
So what we're saying here then is that, you know, with the salt water and the fresh water and the combination of the clay, that can produce electricity.
Yes, and if you also take into consideration that isthmus sits at the head of your ley line that runs up from Wren, we have major sources of energy coming to that spot. And we also have a structure there that is indistinguishable from a type of battery that is produced modernly that relies on differential between salinated and fresh water to produce energy.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible, and very and we know that, like you said, they're the ingredients. That's what makes that. So that is. I'm sure that the ancients, you know, they were far more intelligent than we are today. I mean, their legacy that they've left behind, and the legacy, like yourself and many others, are putting these pieces together and looking back and realizing there is just so much that we don't know and that we're just beginning to understand. That's why I find it so exciting about the ancient world, Laird. There is so much more to learn from our ancestors and to discover. And you're definitely ahead of the game there. We're coming up to an hour. I can't believe it. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Laird. How can people get in touch with you and buy your books, for example?
Well, I have an author page through my publisher, Inner Traditions. So you can go to innertraditions.com and find a Laird Scranton page. I joke that people shouldn't confuse me with all the other Laird Scrantons. There are no others. I also have an author page at simonandschuster.com. My books are on all the usual outlets on Amazon. You can go to Barnes and Noble bookstore and likely find one or more of my books on the shelf, or certainly order my books through any bookstore. If they want to find me personally, the easiest way to find me is through Facebook. Friend me on Facebook, and then we can communicate through Messenger or through email. Is the easiest way to find me.
Well, that's brilliant. So I find Laird Scranton on Facebook, and I love your groundbreaking work. I've learned so much about the pyramids, taking me way through to Orion. I mean, and Orkney, the island of energy and electricity. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure other people are equally as fascinated. It's been great talking to you, Laird, and we'll catch up again in the future, I am sure.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Stay safe and stay well.
Yes.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.